Let's turn our attention now to the last life story of the book of Genesis. It's the life of Joseph, spanning chapters 37 through 50. Before we do so, let's review what we've seen to this point. The first 11 chapters showing how creation got started, origin of universe, the first family, the first instance of alienation, and then a clean slate through the flood, renewal of creation, leading to eventual dispersal of the nations through the Tower of Babel. As we focus in on Abram, who is renamed Abraham, we find God working to reclaim creation through a family. Abraham, famous for faith that was tested. As far as Isaac goes, just a brief mention of his biography. He is almost an echo of his father, spanning only 2 chapters. And most recently, we've studied Jacob, seeing him as one intent on a blessing, even to the extent of wresting it from God. Incidentally, a comment is in order regarding chapter 36. If you've paid close attention, you've probably noticed that some of my chapter spans for Jacob will include chapter 36, some stop at 35. The reason being, if you notice the content of 36, it's neither Jacob nor the next biography, Joseph. It rather ties off the lineage of Esau or Edom. So it's a bit of a piece apart. It's neither Jacob nor Joseph, which explains why sometimes when I've concentrated on a biography, I'll just limit it to that character, leaving out chapter 36. And now then we come to Joseph, 37 through 50. I'll refrain from putting a title on this. Perhaps you're already beginning to imagine how you might subscript or title that particular life. Here then is the location of the material in a linear scheme of the book of Genesis. Let's give a brief overview of the flow of events in Joseph's life. He grows up as the favored son of his father Jacob and his father's favorite wife Rachel. Here's a reminder of the various members of Jacob's family. On the left, you see his wife Rachel. Second son by Rachel is Benjamin. Incidentally, the numerals for the sons indicate the birth order, so that Reuben is firstborn and youngest among all the children born to Jacob is Benjamin. As a young person in that family, we know that he received dreams of prominence that did not put him in good favor with his siblings. In fact, they respond by kidnapping him and selling him into slavery, where he winds up serving in the chief of guards household, Potiphar. He maintains purity, sexual purity, despite temptation by Potiphar's wife. And the price he pays for integrity is that he's framed and subsequently imprisoned for 2 long years. The Hebrew expression there is days of years. Subsequently, he interprets some dreams, including dreams of Pharaoh, and as a result is elevated to the position of vizier, or might think of it as prime minister. During the period of his tenure as vizier, he encounters his brothers again, winds up welcoming his aged father Jacob to Egypt, and then buries his father Jacob as he expires. And the book closes with an assurance issued to his brothers that Joseph will not take vengeance on them now that his father has passed away. We'll close in then focusing more closely on the life of Jacob by beginning with some historical notes. Consider, for example, the fact that Joseph, as a young person, we're told was favored, and a symbol of that favor was a colorful robe. These tomb paintings are known as the Beni Hassan tomb. So you can, in Egypt, as you can see, it dates to around 1890 BC. Two things strike us. First of all, the multicolored clothing. The paint pigment can be detected from surviving coloration there in the tomb wall paintings. Now, this is a tomb in Egypt. However, the particular facial hair, the coiffure, the appearance, the grooming of these individuals indicates that they are Asiatics. These are not Egyptians, but rather visitors. So we put two and two together and say, here are some people from outside Egypt, from the Asiatic region, with multicolored tunics or robes. We're not suggesting that any of these were Joseph. We're just saying the general time frame fits, and the locale, the point of origin of these individuals, and the color of their garments kind of attests to the sort of thing described for Joseph. And next is the issue of cisterns. We're told that Joseph's brothers incarcerated him in a cistern while they're figuring out what to do with him. Would they kill him or would they sell him, which eventually they sell him. The next few slides will demonstrate how important was water catchment in order to sustain living in the arid region of Palestine. We're going to move many centuries later than Joseph and to a region at some distance from where he was incarcerated, held prisoner in a cistern. The region we're moving to now is near the Dead Sea, and the site is Masada. Herod had Masada fortified. It appears, if you were to look at a top view of Masada, it would look like a large and oversized stone ship in the foothills or the beach area to the west of the Dead Sea. So it's a rather longitudinal island in dry land, if you want to think of it that way. So here is the northern, kind of the bow of this stone, this rock island. The structures that you see cascading down the northern tip there are the palatial dwellings there of the monarch, as he has outfitted this refuge to be a fairly comfortable place. And that was the model. Now you can see the actual remains there on the Masada site. Lift your eyes a bit and look to the upper region, and you see the bluish color. That's the Dead Sea, looking off to the east. Other parts of that northern edge appear with this rocky, rock-strewn and perforated surface, this geological surface. Notice the cyan line that's running roughly horizontal in the lower right portion. What would happen is water would be directed from the hillsides behind us as we're standing right now facing the Dead Sea. There are the foothills behind us that eventually will lead up and over into the area of Jerusalem, some kilometers back west of us, behind us. Now from those hills then water would descend down towards the Dead Sea, and the hydroengineering of this particular Masada site was such that they would catch that runoff and actually direct it across not a plaza, but a ravine, I guess you might say, between the foothills leading to this Masada site. They would catch it and then direct it along this pathway. You can still see the remnants of the pathway there below the blue line in the direction of these perforations. So these are man-made openings into caverns. The next slides will be taken standing in the mouth of these caverns and looking down into the open rooms, large rooms where they would trap the water. Here's a gentleman who is one of the members of our tour, standing just inside one of those doorways. At the top, then this railing will lead downwards to the left. Notice the change in surface from very rough-hewn rock in the ceiling giving way to very smooth surface. That's because they plastered over the parts of this large room, this water catchment room, in order to retard any permeation of the water and loss of it through leakage. Now this room will fall away below. Here you see the railing getting narrower and narrower as the perspective leads further and further down to the base of this large room. Again, rough rock in the upper left, and then giving way to smooth plastering to make it waterproof. Where the cursor is traveling right now represents the lower corner of the far wall and then the floor. So here is the lower corner where wall and floor meet, and here is the right corner where the two vertical walls meet. You can see these members of our tour who are very small figures there. Gives you a notion of how deep this is. Another feature that might stand out to you is the change in lateral colors, almost like strata. These are not geological strata. These would be stain lines from the various times when water came up to a level and then held that level for a period of time. You can see a stain line far, far at the top. This is one of 4 cisterns that you saw next to each other, and there are many more across Masada. Just another adjacent room. You can see this one doesn't have all the side railings in place. Again, the stain line of where the water held. Finding ways to capture water in this arid climate was very, very important, and this is one of the more massive examples of that. Here we are standing at the very base, the bottom, and looking up towards the mouth. Another interesting point regarding historical context has to do with the price reported for the sale of Joseph as a slave. It's reported as 20 shekels. When we look to documents outside the Bible, we find that in this time frame, that was an attested price for a slave, though there's a point of accuracy in comparison. Before moving on to the next point, it's worth acknowledging that the individuals involved in capturing or in transporting Joseph are alternatively known as Midianites or Ishmaelites. Nahum Sarna notices this and observes that in places like Judges 8:24, we also find these two terms used together. And so he concludes that either the term Ishmaelite actually has a meaning of nomadic trader, that is to say, not limited to or strictly a descendant of Ishmael, but has a meaning of nomadic trader in this setting, rather than being an ethnic reference. Or the two at this point were interchangeable, since both Ishmaelites and Midianites came from Abraham. Now, regarding an Asian slave being elevated in Potiphar's house, we're referring to Joseph as a non-Egyptian and Asian, and the fact that Joseph rises to a position of leadership among the other hired help in Potiphar's house. Some might look at that and say, how could that be? Why, he seems to even supersede some of the local Egyptian help. How could an outsider come to that status of superiority? It's interesting to note that outside the Bible, we have uncovered lists of slaves within households, and based on these documents, we've been able to ascertain that this is not a unique situation where an outsider, an Asian, would rise to a level of superiority within the workers of a particular household. And next, referring to the episode in Joseph's life where Potiphar's wife approaches him for sexual favors, and he refuses. Again, it's Sarna who comments that for Joseph to have given in, to have complied with this, would have been completely normal. In fact, sexual promiscuity was basically a given. It was expected among the slave population. Consequently, for someone of Joseph's status, a foreigner, an employee, a slave, to say no to his boss's wife was a very, very courageous act, and one that was completely out of keeping with the culture. He was going counterculture at this point. If there is someone who fell out of political favor or for some reason needed punishment, it wasn't the typical thing for an ancient society to maintain a prison household or some place of incarceration of that sort. Rather, they might just discipline on the spot of whatever level, be it minor discipline or capital punishment. So the fact that Egypt maintains prisons is significant, and we know that's historically accurate. Next, the topic of dreams. You're aware that Joseph interprets dreams for some of Pharaoh's employees who are incarcerated in prison, and then subsequently he will interpret dreams for Pharaoh himself. As we get acquainted with Egyptian culture, we realize that dreams are very, very important to these people. In fact, there's a document known as the Chester Beatty Papyrus III, third papyrus, which is devoted to helping enable people to interpret dreams. We're not suggesting Joseph wrote or depended on that document. We're just saying, please be aware they took dream interpretation so serious they even left a document behind to help people do so. Next, let's turn to the topic of famines in Egypt and the Nilometer. We find in chapter 41 of Genesis the account of the famine that Joseph predicts through the dream given to Pharaoh, and then the steps that Joseph takes to alleviate the suffering and preserve the Egyptian people, and incidentally, the Israelite people as well. Now, we are aware from extra-biblical evidence from Egyptian documents themselves, various accounts exist that such famines would take place from time to time. We're not saying that there is extra-biblical reference to the Joseph famine. We're just saying that this fits with what we know from information outside the Bible. Again, I'm indebted to Nahum Sarna's Jewish Publication Society commentary on Genesis for what I'll read here in this portion. He writes, the motif of 7-year famines are well documented in Egyptian and other Near Eastern texts. He goes on to name a gentleman by the name of Iti, who was treasurer of the town of Imyotru, who boasted that he supplied his fellow citizens in barley in the years of famine and helped other towns as well. And then there's the Seneni of Coptus, who makes a similar record in a stela, that would be a stone monument, raised to commemorate what he has achieved. Another gentleman by the name of Ankhtifi, who was known as a great chieftain of Nekhen, recorded, notice this, a 7-year famine. That would be the same dimension as Joseph's, wouldn't it? In which the entire south of Egypt is said to have died of hunger, to the extent people devoured their own children. And he took pride in having foreseen the event, that reminds us of Joseph, doesn't it? Caused by a low Nile, that is inadequate flooding, and he was able to rush grain and grant loans of corn to people in various towns to alleviate the situation. So, periodic famines and some rescuers. This is not an unknown phenomenon from Egyptian writing. Now, you may have noted mention that in particular times the flood of the Nile would be insufficient. There would be a low Nile, and this is what would cause the famine. The crops then would not grow properly. This was so important, that monitoring the level of the Nile was so important, that upstream in the region of Karnak, which you may be acquainted with by the development on the west side of the Nile, the corresponding west side would be the Valley of the Kings. Karnak is on the same latitude as that on the east side. Here are some of the things that we find in Karnak. For one thing, these majestic hypostyle hall with these phenomenal columns. Some of these are representing papyrus reeds. Notice the hieroglyphs incised. Here's a brief description of this particular hall. Our focus is moving beyond the hall to the north edge of it. There's a feature that I'd like you to see. But here you can see the time frame and quantity, 134 columns, roughly in the 1300s BC. King Seti and Ramses, we'll come back to these in Exodus, those names, Ramses, Seti, relative to the time frame of Moses. And now here on that same estate, that same complex, we find this incision down into the soil. This is an ancient retention wall and trough that's been dug. It's very dark. You can't see too well, except you can tell it's descending. Now notice this light portion there at the base. This is not some paint or a light-colored rock. This is reflection off the water. You can see the water lines here. This is Nile water. The Nile itself is behind us. To the right is north, upstream. To the left would be south, downstream. The Nile is behind us, I'd estimate, about a mile. But in earlier times, it would have come closer. But in any case, the water table here, influenced by the Nile. So on this ceremonial and religious complex, they were able to monitor the level of the Nile. This was so important for being aware of seasons and being aware of the flow of this pivotal river. And their health and their crops were so dependent on that. Two more elements on this page relative to historical context. One has to do with wisdom in Egypt. There's mention in chapter 41, verse 8, of magicians and wise men. Magicians and wise men. I want to pause just long enough to note that Egypt was famous for their wise men. In fact, they left behind them numerous documents, sapiential literature or wisdom literature, one of which is the wisdom of Amenemope. We're using this, referring to it just in illustrative fashion. We're not suggesting this was in Moses, or rather in Joseph's time frame. If we put Joseph, what shall we say, around 1700 BC, something on that order, we would find that this document is much later. The earliest copies we have, a potsherd, dates to around 1100 BC. So there's not a time frame overlap, but rather we're saying that Egypt was proud of its extensive wisdom culture. You're looking at a hieratic script here. This particular copy of it dates to, I think it was around 600 BC. You can access this in the British Museum. It's known as the Wisdom of Amenemope. So when Joseph joins the Egyptian court, Pharaoh's court, he is joining a bureaucracy, part of which is famous for wisdom. Joseph himself conducts as a wise person within that culture. A small note from chapter 41, verse 14 indicates that when Joseph was elevated from the prison, it was important for him to shave. You saw this scene earlier. These are Syrians. These are people, or Semites, Asiatics, from the territory that Joseph used to live in. Notice that they have beards. That's part of the way we know that these are not Egyptians. In contrast, the Egyptians typically present themselves clean-shaven. Here is Tutankhamun, better known as King Tut, in a battle scene. Notice he is clean-shaven. And some of these figures, I believe these would be representing Ramses, clean-shaven, with the exception perhaps of a ceremonial sort of beard, but otherwise presenting themselves clean-shaven is part of the fashion, part of the proper appearance for an Egyptian, and Joseph needed to comply with that when he appeared before the Pharaoh. Continuing with historical features that appear in the Joseph account, we're interested as we read of his elevation to a high political position. We call that process the investiture, as he is invested with the privileges and signs of that office. We're interested in some of the details that are recorded. For example, in chapter 41, we find his title, the title of his position, as being one who is in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Egyptologists look at some of the bureaucracy titles that we find coming from the Egyptian literature, and we think it may correspond to a known Egyptian title called Chief of the Entire Land. Next, we're told that Joseph is honored by being clothed in fine linen. Now, it's interesting to notice that the word recorded in Genesis for this fine linen is the word shesh. Shesh means fine linen, but it's of particular importance to us that this word is itself a loan word from shes, which is an Egyptian word. When you ask yourself, well, why is this significant? It would be like looking over menu items in some English literature or American literature account and encountering the word sushi. As soon as you do that, you realize this is not Native American cuisine. This is Asian. This is Japanese. Sushi has become, in the American language, a loan word from the Japanese language. Sheish was a loan word from Egyptian in the Hebrew vocabulary. Now, why would that happen? In the case of sushi, it's because you need to go to the Japanese culture to understand what this particular food is that's been imported and become a favorite among many residents in English-speaking countries. Similarly, with this fine linen, Egypt was the source, the premier source for this high-quality loom-produced linen. This particular picture I really enjoy because the way that it seems to capture the delicacy of the fabric. You can see this is from a papyrus, an illustrated papyrus, Papyrus Hunefer. The document, of which there are multiple copies, is called the Book of the Dead, and this particular copy of it dates to around 1300 BC. This would be subsequent to Joseph's time, but definitely very, very early. Notice not only the color, the clean white appearance of this woven fabric that they're wearing, but notice the fact that you can see the limbs of the people. The legs are visible through the fabric. My suspicion is that this is the artist's way of showing us that the fabric was almost a gossamer texture. It was so high quality, so finely woven, that you could actually detect some features through the fabric. This is not everyday wear. This is not commoner's clothing. It's not simple production. This is very, very high fashion, high grade material. Egypt was the source for this. Not surprisingly then, this account of Joseph being elevated to a premier position, he is granted a suit of clothes of Egypt's best, and it's recorded in the Hebrew scriptures using an Egyptian loanword. Now, the gold chain, we're told that also part of the investiture was giving to Joseph a gold chain. In the past, I've thought of this as simply perhaps a heavy link chain of precious metal. But more likely, we should be thinking of something like we see here on the shoulders surrounding the neck of King Tutankhamun. This particular art piece actually constitutes the back of the chair, the throne of King Tut. You can see this in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. When we say back of the chair, we're not talking about what you would see if you're standing behind the chair, but it's actually if King Tut is sitting in the chair, his back is touching this. It is what supports his back. It's a beautiful piece. This is a zoom in on a detail of it. The rest of this sort of a heavy foil type bas-relief artistic piece. Gorgeous, gorgeous piece. And as I recall, the brown portions, the skin portions, are stone, jeweled or precious stone that has been pressed in, and then you have gold and evidently silver. It looks like his sister/wife in this situation is applying some perfume, some fragrant oils to him. We're talking here about the collar, and the female figure has one as well. This is not the clothing of commoners. This is very, very special and indicating a person of high office. It would be a combination of precious stones and also a flexible piece of metal. Flexible in the sense of like chain mail. It would have had some hinging to it or wiring. So this element of Joseph's investiture matches what we would expect for someone receiving high honor from the Pharaoh. Next, consider with me the name that is given to Joseph by the Pharaoh. It's recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures as being pronounced Zaphenat Paneah. Zaphenat Paneah, verse 45 in chapter 41. Egyptologists look at this and ask themselves, what Egyptian words may this have represented? And it's suggested that this may have represented the Egyptian phrase Jedpa Necher Iuf Anch, which translates, God speaks, he lives. Perhaps, and again this is conjectural, perhaps that name was awarded to Joseph to commemorate the fact that Joseph was an agent for Pharaoh to hear when God would speak. And this was a God who was a living God. He was very much involved. The question may be asked, how could someone who was an outsider, not a native Egyptian, rise to such a prominent position within Pharaoh's court, such as Joseph did? Actually, there are a couple of eras when we know that persons who were not native Egyptians held high posts. The first would be in the Hyksos era, 1750 to 1550. Here, the entire court was non-Egyptian. The second would pertain to the Amarna age, 14th century and so on, two figures, Yanchamu and Ben Ozen. Yanchamu is an individual who became an Egyptian commissioner representing or serving as liaison for Canaan and Syria. That happened in Akhenaten's era, 1370 and subsequent. He was a Semite. He was not an Egyptian. And then there's also Ben Ozen. He harkens actually from the territory east of Lake Tiberias, so right in Canaan. Lake Tiberias is Sea of Galilee. He was elevated to the role of a royal herald or marshal, and that was under the pharaoh Merneptah in the 1200s. Consequently, we see that whether it's the Hyksos era, where there was general leadership by outsiders, or isolated leaders from outside Egypt during the Amarna age, the notion of a Semite rising to a high political post was not unheard of. Our last element from the historic lens has to do with taxes in the ancient world. You may recall that Joseph set up a 20% tax on future harvests. That appears in chapter 47, verses 24 and following. Now, we're not suggesting that we have any extra biblical evidence confirming or denying this practice in Egypt, but in some of the neighboring empires, there is evidence of taxes. Under Hammurabi in Babylon, we read that the state's share of harvest from administered fields, that is, fields that were administered for the government, that state share would vary between 2/3 of the crop, or perhaps diminished a bit to 1/2 of the crop, after the farmer had made a deduction for any production expenses. So a fairly high tax or rental, basically, of evidently state-owned or administered lands. In Babylon, it was not uncommon to encounter an interest rate of 20%, and that had to do with money loans rather than crops. In contrast to that, the rate of loans for produce was about 33%. So once again, when we find Joseph imposing a tax on crops, future crops, to strengthen the position of the pharaoh, that was not unheard of in the ancient world.